The storm came without mercy on the night Celia Beckett lost the only thing besides her land that she truly owned, and when the thunder split the sky open like a wound, she knew before she even ran to the paddock that Duchess was already gone. The year was 1882, and the Arizona Territory was not a forgiving place for a woman alone. Celia had learned that lesson early, first when her mother died of fever 3 winters past, and then again when her father followed her into the ground not 18 months later, leaving Celia with 40 acres of dry land, a small herd of 20 cattle, a 2-room homestead that leaked in 6 places, and a bay mare named Duchess who had been her companion since she was 16 years old. Celia was 22 now, and she stood at the edge of the broken paddock fence in the pouring rain, her dark hair plastered to her neck, her boots sinking into the red mud, and she felt the kind of grief that does not announce itself with tears, but instead settles into the chest like a stone dropping into still water. The fence post had been hit by a falling branch. That much was clear. The wood was splintered clean through, and the gate hung open at an angle that told its own sorry story. Duchess had always been skittish in storms. Celia had known that, had intended to bring her into the barn before the weather turned, but the rain had come faster than she expected, and then the roof in the main room had started leaking again, and she had been up on a chair trying to stuff a rag into the gap, and by the time she thought of Duchess, the crack of lightning against the old cottonwood at the south edge of her property had already sent the mare somewhere into the dark. Celia searched for 2 hours in the rain. She walked the perimeter of her land calling Duchess's name until her voice went rough, and the mud came up past her ankles in the low places near the creek. The creek was running high and fast, swollen with the storm runoff, and Celia stood at its edge with her lantern and felt the fear move through her like cold water because there were places along that creek where the bank cut steep, and a frightened horse in the dark could easily lose its footing. She did not let herself think about that too long. She turned back toward the house and told herself that Duchess was smart, that Duchess had likely found shelter somewhere, maybe in the old Harlan barn 3 miles east that had been empty since the Harlan family pulled up and moved to California 2 years ago. She told herself that. She did not entirely believe it. By morning the storm had passed and left the world looking washed and quiet and indifferent to Celia's particular heartbreak. She was out again at first light, tracking along the muddy ground for hoofprints, following them as far as she could before they mixed with the churned-up mess left by the creek's overflow. She found a patch of dark bay hair caught on the barbed wire of her south fence line, and her stomach dropped, though she told herself it could mean anything, that Duchess had just brushed against the wire getting through. She did not find the mare. By noon she had walked 7 miles in every direction, and her boots had rubbed her heels raw, and she had not eaten since the evening before, and she was standing at the edge of the Calvert Road, which cut through this part of the Arizona Territory, connecting the smaller settlements to the town of Red Rock 12 miles north, and she was working very hard at not crying when she heard the sound of hooves on the packed dirt road. The rider came from the north, moving at an easy trot, and even from a distance Celia could see that the horse beneath him was something exceptional. It was a stallion, dark as midnight ink with a single white blaze down its face, and it moved with the kind of fluid confidence that only comes from an animal that has been raised well and trained better. The man in the saddle was tall even seated, wearing a worn brown canvas duster that had clearly seen many years of honest work, and a hat that had been shaped by weather and time into exactly the right angle. He had the look of a man who spent more hours outdoors than in, and when he pulled his horse to a stop a few feet from where Celia was standing, she could see that his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, like sage after rain, and that they were taking in her state with the kind of careful attention that was not rude but simply observant. "You look like you've lost something," he said. It was not the most poetic thing anyone had ever said to her, but there was a directness to it that Celia appreciated. She was not in the mood for pleasantries. "My horse," she said. A bay mare about 15 hands, star marking on her forehead. She broke through the paddock fence last night in the storm. I've been searching since first light. The man's expression shifted into something that was not quite a frown but was close to it, the look of a person hearing news they find genuinely troubling. Storm like last night, she could have gone a fair distance, he said. He looked out over the land to the south and west the way men who know the territory do, reading the landscape like text. That creek's been running high. Any chance she went that direction? I found hair on the south fence wire, Celia said, because she was a practical woman and lying to herself in private was one thing, but lying to someone who might be able to help was another matter entirely. The man looked at her steadily. How long have you had her? 6 years, since she was 3. He nodded slowly, and something in his expression told her he understood exactly what 6 years with a horse meant, what that kind of bond was. I'm Graham Brooks, he said, and he touched the brim of his hat, not in any exaggerated fashion but in the simple, genuine way of a man who was raised to show respect. I've got a spread about 4 miles north and east of here, the Double B. I know this land pretty well. Celia Beckett, she said. My place is just back over that rise. She gestured behind her. I appreciate the offer of help, but I don't want to keep you from your work. I can manage. She said it because it was the thing a person in her situation was expected to say, not because she entirely meant it. Graham Brooks looked at her with those gray-green eyes and he said, I don't doubt that you can manage, Miss Beckett. But there are 2 of us right now and one of me on a good horse who can cover ground faster. And if your mare is out there somewhere, she's got a better chance of being found with 2 sets of eyes than one. There was no argument in his voice. He was simply stating facts, the way you might state that the sky was blue or that the ground was wet. Celia looked at him for a moment, measuring the sincerity in his face, and found nothing there to distrust. All right, she said. They spent the rest of that afternoon searching, Graham on his magnificent stallion, whose name was Atlas, and Celia mostly on foot since her own horse was what they were looking for. Graham offered her the saddle twice, and she refused twice, though on the second offer she did accept his help in climbing up behind him for a stretch when the terrain got rocky, and her raw heels were making every step a small misery. She sat behind him on Atlas's broad back and held on to the back of Graham's duster, and tried to be sensible about the warmth of another person after a night and morning of being very much alone with her fear. They found Duchess in the late afternoon. The mare was alive, which was the first thing, and Celia felt the relief of it hit her so hard she had to stop walking for a moment and press her hand flat against her sternum. Duchess had gone through the south fence line and made her way about 2 miles east, where she had apparently spooked again at something in the dark and fallen into a dry gully that had filled with storm runoff. She had managed to get out of the water, which was the mercy in the story, but her right front leg had a deep cut from what appeared to be a piece of submerged fence wire, and she was standing at the edge of the gully shaking with cold and exhaustion, and clearly not putting any weight on that leg. Celia went to her immediately, talking low and steady the way she always talked to Duchess, and the mare pressed her head against Celia's chest with a heaviness that felt like trust and apology in equal measure. Celia ran her hands down the injured leg carefully. The cut was significant. It would need to be cleaned and wrapped, and Duchess was going to need to be kept still for at least several weeks if the leg was going to heal right. It's a bad cut, Graham said quietly from where he stood holding Atlas's reins a respectful distance back. You've got the supplies to treat it at your place. I have some, Celia said. Enough to get started. I've got more at the Double B, he said. Better bandaging, some drawing salve. I can ride and get it. You've already spent half a day helping me, Celia said, and she looked up at him from where she was crouched beside Duchess's leg, and the angle of the late afternoon sun was making everything look golden, and she told herself that was why his face looked the way it did, like something she wanted to keep looking at. Miss Beckett, he said with a tone that was patient but firm, I'm going to go get those supplies. Can you get her back to your place from here on your own? I can, she said, slowly. Then I'll meet you there. He was gone before she could think of another objection. Atlas moving into a ground-covering canter that made the distance between them stretch out in seconds. Celia watched him go and then turned back to Duchess and began the slow, careful walk back toward home. He was waiting at her gate when she got there, his horse tied to the fence post, and he was sitting on the top rail with his hat pushed back on his head and a canvas bag of supplies beside him. And the sight of him there was so unexpectedly welcome that Celia had to remind herself she had only met the man 4 hours ago. They worked on Duchess's leg together in the fading daylight, and then by lantern light when the dark came down. Graham was skilled with animals in the way of a person who has spent their whole life around them, confident and gentle at the same time, and he and Celia moved around each other in the small space of the barn, with the ease of people who have always known each other, which was strange because they had not. Celia said so without meaning to, something about it being odd how comfortable it was, and Graham looked at her from the other side of Duchess and said, "Good things are like that sometimes." And then he went back to what he was doing, and Celia went back to what she was doing, and neither of them said anything for a while. When Duchess was settled and her leg was cleaned and wrapped and she had eaten some grain and was resting in the stall with her eyes half closed, Celia stood and straightened her back and looked at Graham across the quiet of the barn. "Thank you," she said. "Really, I mean it." "I know you do," he said. He gathered up the supplies, the leftover bandaging and the tin of drawing salve. "I'll leave this with you. Keep cleaning it twice a day and watch for any heat in the leg that wasn't there before." "I know how to care for a horse," she said, and she was not offended, just gently correcting. "I know you do," he said again, and he smiled for the first time, and it was the kind of smile that changed the whole architecture of a face. It was quiet and genuine and a little slow in coming, like it meant something when it arrived. He rode home in the dark. Celia watched the shape of him disappear down the road, and then she went inside and made herself a late supper of cornbread and salt pork, and she sat at her table and thought about gray-green eyes and a smile that meant something. The next 3 weeks were full of the particular kind of daily work that defines life on a homestead in the Arizona Territory in 1882. Celia mended the paddock fence herself using the post driver her father had left her, and new lumber she had purchased in Redrock on credit from the merchant there, a man named Albright who was fair enough in business though his prices were steep for a woman alone. She maintained her small cattle herd, checking the water trough, watching the range grass, keeping an eye on the 2 cows that had calves running with them. She did all the 10,000 small tasks that kept a 40-acre homestead functioning, and she checked Duchess's leg twice a day exactly as Graham had told her to. And she thought about Graham Brooks more often than she thought was entirely sensible. He came back 4 days after the night of the storm. He came on a Tuesday, which she knew because she kept careful track of the days in the small ledger she used for accounting, and he came in the late morning with a look that said he had business in the area and had stopped by incidentally, though Celia had already noticed that the road that ran past her place was not on any natural route from the Double B to anywhere Graham Brooks would have reason to go. She did not say this. She showed him Duchess's leg, which was healing well, and she offered him coffee because it would have been rude not to, and they sat on the steps of her porch in the warm morning and talked. She found out things about him in the way you find things out about a person when you are not asking directly, but simply listening. He had come to the Arizona Territory from Texas 6 years ago, at 24, with a small amount of capital and a large amount of stubbornness. He had built the Double B from a single quarter section of land into something he was clearly proud of without ever quite saying so. He ran about 300 head of cattle and had 4 hands working for him, which in this part of Arizona made him a prosperous man, though not a wealthy one. He had never married. He had a sister in San Antonio named Ruth who wrote him letters he kept in a tin box under his bed. His mother was gone. His father was still alive and difficult, and they did not speak much. He found out things about her, too, in the same oblique way, that she had been born in the territory, which made her unusual, that she had been educated by her mother, who had been a school teacher before she married, that she could read and write and cipher, and had read every book in the small collection her father had left on the shelf above the fireplace, including a battered copy of Shakespeare's comedies that she had read so many times she could recite passages from it, that she intended to keep this land and make it work even though everyone in Redrock seemed to have an opinion about whether a woman alone could manage 40 acres in the Arizona territory, and most of those opinions were skeptical. "What do you think?" she asked him. She was looking out over the dry grass of her land, gold and brown in the autumn light, and she asked the question without looking at him. "I think you already have been managing it," he said. "For how long?" 18 months, she said. "Since my father passed. Then I think the question's already answered," he said. She looked at him then sideways, and he was looking out over the land the same way she was, and his profile was clean and steady against the sky, and she thought again about the way his smile changed his whole face. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and by the third Tuesday she had stopped pretending it was incidental, and he had stopped pretending there was any other reason he came this particular direction on a Tuesday morning. The courtship, if that was what it was slow and careful, and conducted mostly in conversation on her porch steps, or walking the fence line of her property, while he helped her check the wire for damage. He fixed the leaking section of her roof without asking, just showed up one Saturday with materials, and spent the morning on top of her house while she handed things up to him and argued mildly about whether she could have done it herself, which she probably could have. He introduced her to his ranch hands when she rode into town one day and encountered them at the general store, and the introductions were easy and natural, and she noticed that the men treated him with genuine respect rather than the performed kind. She met his foreman, a weathered man of about 50 named Cobb, who had been with Graham since the early days of the Double B, and who looked at Celia with the particular assessing look of a person who is measuring you against a standard they care about. She must have met the standard because he tipped his hat and said, "Miss Beckett, Graham's told us about your spread. That's good land you've got there." And there was nothing in his voice but honest appraisal. Duchess healed slowly but steadily. By the 5th week she was putting full weight on the injured leg, though Celia was careful not to work her. By the 7th week, the cut had closed cleanly and the heat was gone from the leg, and Duchess was standing at the paddock fence with her old, impatient energy, tossing her head when Celia came out in the mornings. The night Duchess was fully healed, Graham came for supper. This was the first time he had come for supper, which was different from coming for coffee on a Tuesday morning, and Celia made roast chicken with the herbs she grew in a small kitchen garden on the south side of the house, and biscuits with sorghum, and a dried apple pie from the last of the apples she had put up in summer. They ate at her small table and they talked the way they always talked, easy and honest, but there was something different about the interior of the house at evening, about the way the lamplight fell on things and made everything warmer and more particular. Graham ate with genuine appreciation and told her so without effusion. Just the simple, direct honesty that she had come to understand was simply the way he was. He was not a man who performed emotions. When he felt something, he said so plainly, and when he did not feel something, he did not manufacture it. After supper, they sat outside in the cool of the evening on the steps again, which was their place. The sky above the Arizona territory in the fall of 1882 was a remarkable thing, black and enormous, and scattered with stars that had no competition from any artificial light for hundreds of miles in any direction. And Celia sat with her knees together and her hands in her lap and watched the stars and felt Graham sitting beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I don't say things I don't mean," he said, which was a preamble which meant whatever was coming mattered. "So when I say this, I need you to know I've thought on it carefully." She turned to look at him. He was looking at his own hands, which were resting on his knees. "I've been coming out here for 2 months," he said, And I come because I want to, not out of neighborliness, though I am your neighbor. I come because I think about this place and about you all week, and Tuesday morning I wake up and I'm glad it's Tuesday." He looked up then and his eyes found hers in the dark. "I think you know that already." "I had some suspicion," she said, because she was not going to pretend otherwise. "I'm not a man who does things halfway," he said. "So I want to be honest about what I'm doing, which is courting you, if that's something you want." The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that holds something important. "It's something I want," Celia said. He reached out and covered her hand with his, and it was the first time he had touched her in any way that was more than incidental, and his hand was large and warm and calloused, and she turned her hand palm up and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that under the enormous Arizona sky for a long time. The courtship, now that it was official rather than merely implied, brought its own set of complications, because nothing in 1882 in the Arizona Territory was simple for anyone with any complication to their life, and Celia Beckett was nothing but complicated. The most pressing complication was a man named Darnell Prout. Prout owned a ranch adjacent to Celia's property on the western side, a much larger operation called the Lazy P, and he had been after Celia's 40 acres since before her father was in the ground. He was a man of about 50 who had made his money in cattle and land speculation, and who believed, with the particular confidence of a man who has never been told no very firmly, that everything in his vicinity was naturally available to him if he wanted it enough. He had approached Celia 3 times in the 18 months since her father died with offers to buy her land, each time increasing his price slightly, each time acting as though the previous refusal had simply been a preliminary negotiation rather than an actual answer. The 4th time he came, it was October, 2 weeks after Graham and Celia had formally acknowledged their courtship, and Prout came in the middle of the morning while Celia was out checking the south fence line. He was on his big gray horse, and he had 2 of his ranch hands with him, which was unnecessary for a social call, and was intended to communicate something. "Miss Beckett," he said, looking down at her from his horse with the lazy assurance of a man who does not often look up at things, "I heard you lost your horse in that storm back in September." "I found her again," Celia said. She kept her hands easy at her sides and her voice level. "Good, good," he said. "Must have been a frightening time for you. Woman alone out here." He looked around at her property with the look of a man calculating square footage. "I've been thinking about my offer, and I want to put something new on the table. I'll give you $600 for this place. That's a fair price, and you know it." $600 was actually a fair price. It was almost exactly what the land was worth at current territory rates, which was precisely why Celia was not going to take it, because the point was not the money. The point was this land, which her father had held and his father before him had cleared and broke, and which Celia had every intention of holding herself. "Mr. Prout," she said, "I've given you my answer 3 times already, and today is going to be the 4th time, and I'd appreciate it if you would let it also be the last time. This land is not for sale." Prout looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite threatening but was adjacent to it, the look of a man recalculating. Then he looked past her shoulder, and his expression shifted into something more neutral. Celia turned. Graham was coming across the south field on Atlas, and he must have seen Prout's party from the road because he was coming directly rather than by the gate, and when he reached them, he reined Atlas to a stop and looked at the assembled group with his particular quality of stillness that was not passivity but something more like compressed attention. "Prout," he said. "Brooks," said Prout, and something in the single syllable told Celia this was not the first time these 2 men had been in a room together with the temperature up. "Anything I can help you with?" Graham said, and the offer was entirely polite and entirely unmistakable in its meaning. "Just a conversation with Miss Beckett," Prout said. "We've finished," Celia said. Prut looked at her, looked at Graham, looked at the hand Graham had resting easy on his thigh, nowhere near anything, just resting, and he tipped his hat in a way that acknowledged the arithmetic of the moment. "I'll see you around, Miss Beckett," he said, and he turned his gray horse and his two hands followed him back toward the road. When they were gone, Celia let out a breath she had not quite known she was holding. "He's been asking about this land since before my father died," she said. Graham dismounted and stood beside Atlas. "I know, he's tried to buy the Calvert parcel on the other side too. Man collects land like other men collect grievances." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said, and she was, mostly. "I don't like being crowded." "No," he agreed, "you wouldn't." And then he took Atlas's reins and walked alongside her back toward the gate, and they did not talk about Prut again that day, though Celia thought about him the way you think about a stone in your boot, a small, persistent discomfort that tells you something about the terrain. November came in cold, which surprised people who imagined Arizona as uniformly hot, and Celia's firewood supply was lower than she wanted it to be. She mentioned this to Graham in passing, the way she mentioned most of her practical concerns, not asking for help but simply being honest, and 3 days later he arrived on a Saturday morning with two of his hands and a wagon loaded with split wood, and they stacked it against the east wall of her barn with the cheerful efficiency of men who like physical work. Celia fed them all lunch and felt something she could not immediately name, something about the sounds of people in her yard, the noise of voices and work, and the ordinary business of being part of something larger than yourself. After his hands had gone back to the wagon, Graham stayed. They walked out to the paddock where Duchess was now fully recovered and running the fence line with her old bright energy, and Graham leaned on the paddock rail and watched the mare with genuine appreciation. "She's a good horse," he said. "She's the best horse," Celia said. "Atlas thinks he's the best horse," Graham said. "Atlas would think that," Celia said. "He's a stallion." "They all think they're the best at everything." Graham turned and looked at her with something in his eyes that was amused and warm and something else, something that made the air feel different. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask," she said. "I might not answer." "Fair," he said. "Do you ever think about what comes next? I mean beyond a season at a time?" She was quiet for a moment because this was the kind of question that deserved a real answer. "I think about keeping this land," she said. "Keeping it and making it better. Maybe adding a few more cattle in the spring. The south pasture could carry more if the water supply was better." She looked at the land, her land, and she felt the old particular love of it that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the specific way a place can become part of a person. "I think about doing it for a long time." "Alone," he said. He asked it simply, without pressure. She looked at him. The late November light was making everything sharp and clear, the way the light gets in the territory when the air is cold, and she could see every line of his face and the earnestness in it and the hope that was there too, honest and unperformed. "I've been alone for a while now," she said. "I'm good at it, but it's not exactly a preference." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I built the Double B with the thought that someday it would be something worth sharing. Not just the land, but the building of it, the every day of it." He looked at her, and she could see the effort in him, the man who did not say things he did not mean, working to say the most important thing he had ever meant. "I think you're who I want to share it with, Celia." It was the first time he had used her first name without the miss in front of it, and the absence of the miss was itself a kind of declaration, small and enormous at the same time. She reached out and took his hand, the way she had that first night on her steps, and he closed his fingers around hers. "I think you might be right about that," she said. He smiled, that slow smile that changed everything, and she felt it move through her the way warmth moves through cold fingers, gradual and then all at once. Christmas in the Arizona Territory in 1882 was a quieter affair than what Celia had read about in the Eastern papers, which always described elaborate celebrations in warm parlors with elaborate decorations. In Red Rock, Christmas was marked at the church by a service that drew most of the settlement's population, and at the general store by a brief lessening of prices on certain goods, and by a community supper held in the largest building in town, which was the saloon cleared of its usual furniture for the occasion. It was a practical celebration, suited to practical people in a practical landscape, and Celia liked it for exactly those qualities. She went to the Christmas supper with Graham. They went together openly, which in a small settlement like Redrock meant something, and people noticed, and opinions were formed and occasionally expressed. Most of the expressions were favorable. Martha Hadley, who ran the boarding house and knew everyone's business, took Celia's arm at the supper and said, "Graham Brooks is a good man, and I've known him long enough to say that with certainty." The blacksmith, a large quiet man named Fredericks, shook Graham's hand and nodded at Celia with the approving nod of a man who considers himself a good judge of character. There were less favorable expressions, too. Prout was at the supper, and he watched Graham and Celia with the look of a man doing arithmetic he does not like the results of. And there was a woman, a widow named Hargrove, who had apparently had her own hopes regarding Graham at some earlier point, and who greeted Celia with a warmth that had the particular brittleness of feelings being carefully managed. Celia was courteous and kind, and tried not to take satisfaction in the situation, largely succeeding. After the supper, Graham walked her back to where she had tied Duchess, who was fully healed by now and moving with all her old fluid grace. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were doing their enormous show overhead, and Celia was warm in her good wool coat, and in the general warmth of an evening that had been better than most evenings for as long as she could remember. "Merry Christmas, Celia," Graham said. He had given her a gift that afternoon when he came to collect her, a small leather-bound journal with good heavy pages, because she had mentioned once in passing that she kept notes and found herself always running out of pages in the small notebooks she bought from Albright's store. And he had remembered that and had ordered this one specially from somewhere. She could see it was not the kind of thing Albright carried. She had given him a pair of riding gloves she had made herself from good leather she had purchased and worked through the fall, and he had looked at them for a long moment with an expression that told her they were exactly right. "Merry Christmas, Graham," she said. He put his hand against her cheek, just for a moment, the back of his fingers gentle against the cold of her skin, and she leaned into it slightly the way Duchess leaned into Celia's hand, the instinct of a creature that knows when it is being touched with care. Then she rode home under the stars and sat by her fire and thought about the future with something she had not felt in a long time, which was genuine, uncomplicated hope. January brought new trouble from the quarter of Darnell Prout, though it came indirectly, and Celia did not know the shape of it immediately. What she noticed first was that Albright at the general store suddenly became difficult about extending her credit, which he had been doing reliably for the year and a half she had been managing alone. He apologized, genuinely uncomfortable, and said that there were new pressures on the business, and he could not carry as many accounts. She paid what she owed and arranged to buy on a cash basis going forward, which was manageable but tight. She noticed next that one of her cattle was missing from the south pasture, and then 2 weeks later another. The gaps in the herd were not explained by any evidence of wolves or illness, and the south pasture bordered Prout's land on its western edge. She rode to Graham's ranch on a Thursday, which was not a Tuesday, which told him something was wrong before she even dismounted. He came out of the barn when he heard Atlas's brother in spirit, the quick hooves of Duchess in his yard, and his expression went immediately to alert. She told him what she had noticed. He listened without interrupting. "The cattle could have drifted," he said carefully when she was done. "They could have," she said, "but the fence on the south pasture is sound. I checked it after the storm, and I've checked it since. And Albright's credit troubles started right after Prout came to talk to me in October." Graham was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was thinking seriously. "You can't prove Prout had anything to do with either of those things," he said. "No," she said, "I know. But I can ride down to Prute's place, he said, and have a conversation with him. I don't need you to fight my battles, she said. I know you don't, he said. But I'd like to be part of whatever battles you're having if that's all right. That's different from fighting them for you. She thought about that distinction for a moment and found it was accurate and important. All right, she said. They rode together to the Lazy P. Prute received them in the yard of his substantial ranch house with the careful watchfulness of a man who has been waiting for something and is not entirely sure what form it will take. He was polite in the outer layer of his manners and something harder underneath, and he listened to Celia's account of her missing cattle with an expression of elaborately concerned surprise. That's a shame, Miss Beckett, he said. Cattle wandering in winter could have gone anywhere. My fences are sound, Celia said. Could have missed something, he said, with the tone of a person being helpful. I'm going to file a report in Redrock, Celia said, with Marshal Keller. Describing the situation and the dates. Prute's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a person's expression shifts when they have been thinking of themselves as invisible and realize they are not. That's your right, he said. It is, Celia agreed. And I'll be mentioning to Keller as well, Graham said in his level way, that I've got cattle on my western range and I've seen no sign of strays from Miss Beckett's herd coming through my land, which would make it odd for her cattle to have wandered east. Prute looked at Graham. Brooks, Prute, Graham said, same as always, just the names, just the weight. They rode back to Celia's place afterward, and Graham helped her do an exact count of her remaining cattle, and they wrote down the number and the description of each animal in her ledger. She filed the report with Marshal Keller in Redrock, who was a decent man in his 50s who took the matter seriously even if there was little immediately he could do. And 3 days after their visit to the Lazy P, Celia found 2 cattle back in her south pasture that she was fairly certain she had not seen there before, which she thought might have been Prute's way of removing evidence rather than any act of conscience. But the effect was that her herd was closer to whole, and the south pasture fence remained sound, and Prute did not come to her land again. Albright's credit restrictions remained, but that was a manageable problem, and in the end a clarifying one, because it made Celia reorganize her accounts with careful precision, and she found that if she sold 2 of her older cows at the spring market in Redrock, she would have enough cash to buy supplies outright and still keep a small reserve for emergencies. February was cold and still and long in the way that February is always long, and Graham and Celia fell into a rhythm that was steady and warm. He came Tuesdays and Saturdays now, and she rode to the Double B occasionally to meet Cobb and the hands in the normal social currency of neighboring ranchers. She met his world and he continued to be part of hers, and the thing between them deepened the way good things deepen, through accumulation of small, honest moments rather than grand gestures. She did ask him once directly, in February, why he had never married before now. They were sitting inside her house by the fire because it was too cold for the porch steps, and they had been talking for 2 hours about everything and nothing, and she asked the question in the space of a natural pause, not as an accusation, just as genuine curiosity. He thought about it seriously before he answered. There were a couple of women over the years, he said. Nothing that went far. One in particular in my first year here, a woman from the settlement east of Redrock. We kept company for a while. He looked at the fire. She wanted to go back east, couldn't stay out here, and I couldn't go, wouldn't. He said it plainly, knowing the distinction. After that, I think I just got busy with the work and I didn't look very hard. And then, Celia said, and then a storm knocked your fence down, he said, and I happened to be on the right road on the right morning. She was quiet for a moment. Do you believe in that kind of thing, in things happening for a reason? I believe in paying attention, he said. Things happen whether you want them to or not. The ones that matter are the ones you notice. She had thought about that for days afterward. March brought the first warmth, and with it, the ranch work that had been waiting all winter, and both Celia and Graham were busy in the particular, absorbed way of people who work land. She moved her cattle to the better spring grass in the north end of her property. She checked and rechecked the water supply from the well and the creek branch that ran along the eastern edge. She planted her kitchen garden. She put up a new section of fence along the northern boundary, where the winter frost had heaved 2 posts out of the ground. She was busy and purposeful, and she loved it, the work of the land, the physical honesty of it. Graham had his own spring push with 300 head of cattle to move and brand, and Celia rode over to help for 2 days during the spring roundup, which she did as a matter of neighborly exchange that was also personal. She could rope well enough. Her father had taught her, and she was not afraid of hard, dirty work, and she could see that Cobb and the hands filed this information approvingly. It was during the spring roundup, on the second evening when the work was done and the hands had gone to their supper, that Graham proposed. He did not plan it as a grand occasion. He told her afterward that he had not planned it that day specifically, that the moment simply arrived with the same quality as the Tuesday mornings on the road and the first night on her porch steps, the quality of rightness, of something aligning. They were washing up at the pump in the yard of the Double B, and the evening was warm and smelled of cattle and cut grass and the particular clean smell of damp earth, and Graham dried his hands on a cloth and turned to her and said, "Celia, I want to marry you. I've wanted to ask for months, and I don't see any reason to keep not asking." She looked at him. He was standing in the golden dusk of a spring evening on his own land, straight and honest and entirely himself, and she felt the feeling she had been feeling for months now with a sudden clarity, the feeling that had no fancy name and needed none. "Yes," she said, "I want that too." He stepped toward her and took her face in both his hands carefully, and kissed her for the first time gently, with a tenderness that she felt in her chest and her throat and behind her eyes, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was steady and sure and real. They were married in Raydrock in April, at the small church on the north end of Main Street, with Martha Hadley and Cobb as witnesses, and most of the settlement in attendance because, in a place like Raydrock in the Arizona Territory in 1882, a wedding was a significant occasion, and people came. The church was small and the decorations were simple, but the minister was sincere, and Graham's face, when he saw Celia come through the church door in her best blue dress, was something she thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. She had not been the kind of girl who dreamed extensively about weddings. She had been too busy being practical. But standing beside Graham in that small church and saying the words clearly and without any doubt whatsoever was its own kind of dream, and it was better than the imagined ones because it was true. The question of the land was something they had talked through with the same directness they brought to everything. Graham's first impulse was that she should move to the Double B, which was larger and more established, and Celia understood the logic of it but felt the resistance in herself, the attachment to her own place, to the land her father had cleared. They found a solution that was entirely theirs. Celia's 40 acres and the Double B were adjacent enough, separated only by the Calvert Road, that they made a proposal to themselves. They would work both operations as one, with the Double B as the primary headquarters and Celia's homestead as a secondary grazing and working property. Celia kept the deed to her land in her own name. This was not the standard arrangement of 1882, and Celia knew it, and Graham had been entirely clear that the land was hers and would remain hers, that he was not interested in absorbing it into his own holdings, but in building something that was genuinely shared between them. "My name is Beckett," Celia said to him the night before the wedding, sitting on her old porch steps for perhaps the last time as Miss Celia Beckett, "and I'd like to keep it alongside yours." "Celia Brooks née Beckett," he said. "That's who you are, both." She looked at him. "That doesn't bother you." "Why would it?" he said. "You're not a piece of land to be absorbed into a deed. You're a person with a name and a history that's yours. Marrying me doesn't change that." She reached over and took his hand and held it. They moved into the Double B after the wedding. Celia bringing her things and her books and her kitchen herbs in pots and her few pieces of furniture that had particular meaning, including her father's chair and her mother's small writing desk. She left the homestead standing because it was sound and they would need it for working the land, and she went over there regularly, and it was simply part of her life, not a grief. The summer of 1882 became the summer of 1883, and the life they built together was what both of them had been building toward without quite knowing the shape of it, until the other person arrived to make it visible. They worked side by side and argued occasionally about practical matters with the passion of two people who both knew what they were talking about. And they made up from those arguments in the quiet, honest way that two people who love each other and are not afraid of honesty make up from things, which is to say with acknowledgement and apology and a returning to themselves. They learned each other through the daily business of life, which is the most thorough kind of learning there is. Celia got to know Graham's ranch hands, each of them with their own texture and history. Cobb, the foreman, who had been everywhere and seen most things and had opinions about all of it that were worth hearing. A young hand named Tomas who had come up from Sonora 3 years ago and whose horse management was exceptional, and who taught Celia a few things about settling a frightened animal that she had not known before. A quiet, steady man named Elias, who had been freed from slavery in Georgia after the war, and had come west for the opportunity that the East had declined to offer him, and who was one of the finest cattlemen Celia had ever seen work. She was aware, and Graham was aware, and Cobb was aware, that Elias' presence at the Double B was not universally welcomed by every person in the territory, and that there were people in and around Redrock who expressed opinions about the matter. Graham had made his position clear when he hired Elias 3 years prior, which was that the Double B hired the best men for the work and asked no other questions, and that position had not changed and would not change. Celia found that she loved Graham additionally for exactly that. The letters from his sister Ruth in San Antonio were a regular feature of their household, and Celia began to write her own letters to Ruth, carefully at first and then with increasing ease, and Ruth wrote back to Celia with the warmth of a woman who had been wanting a sister and found one in an unexpected place. Ruth wrote with the particular dry humor of a person who knows how to observe life precisely, and her letters made Celia laugh aloud, which Graham loved to hear. In the fall of 1883, Celia knew she was pregnant. She told Graham on a Sunday morning in their bedroom before either of them had properly gotten up, and she said it plainly because she did not know any other way. He was very still for a moment, the way he was still when something mattered enormously, and then his face did something she had not seen it do before, which was break open into pure, uncomplicated joy, and he pulled her against him and held on, and she could feel him breathing. "We're all right," she said quietly, because she knew him well enough now to know what the depth of his feeling meant, which was that he was already thinking about everything that could go wrong and already loving this child with the same total commitment he brought to everything he loved. "We're all right," he agreed, his voice muffled against her hair. Their son was born in May of 1884, after a long labor that tested Celia's considerable reserves of stubbornness and physical endurance, attended by the settlement's doctor from Redrock, a competent man named Hatch who had seen enough frontier births to be calm about the difficult ones, and by Martha Hadley, who had served as midwife for half the births in the territory, and who managed the whole thing with the authority of a woman who has seen worse and emerged fine. Graham was not in the room because that was not the custom, but Celia could hear him in the outer room walking the floor in a slow, steady pattern, which was somehow the most comforting sound she could have asked for, the evidence of his presence, his absolute refusal to be anywhere other than close. When they put the baby in her arms and she looked at him for the first time, she felt a shift in herself, a tectonic kind of change, fundamental and irrevocable, and she understood all over again why her mother had fought so hard for the 40 acres of land and the life they had on it. When Graham came in and she showed him his son, he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, careful and total. And then he looked at Celia, and the look between them was private and complete, a whole language in a single exchange. James, Celia said. She had thought about names carefully and had landed on this one. James Thomas Brooks, if that's all right. James for her father, who had deserved better than the end he got. Thomas for no particular reason, except that it was a good solid name that suited the small solid weight of the child in her arms. James Thomas Brooks, Graham said, and the way he said it confirmed the name was exactly right. Ruth came from San Antonio to meet James, making the journey at considerable inconvenience and expense and arriving looking dusty and delighted and completely herself, which was to say sharp-eyed and warm-hearted and immediately comfortable in Celia's kitchen, in the way of a person who has finally arrived at a place she was supposed to be. Ruth and Celia became, in that visit, the kind of friends who are also family, the category of relationship that is both. They sat up late talking after Graham was in bed, talking about everything with the particular freedom of women who have recognized each other. And when Ruth went back to San Antonio after 3 weeks, she left a gap behind her that was the specific shape of a person you love. But she wrote more letters, even better than before, and that was something. James grew. The Double B and the Beckett homestead, which everyone in the territory called the Beckett parcel for clarity, thrived. Celia made improvements to the homestead buildings in the spring of 1885, not out of sentiment but out of practicality, because the property was now doing significant work as the northern grazing operation for their combined herd, and the buildings needed to be sound. She supervised the improvements herself, a new barn roof and a sturdier fence on the north boundary, and she felt the old particular satisfaction of work done right on land that was hers. Duchess was 12 now, and still going, though Celia had retired her from hard ranch work and kept her for lighter use and for James, who had developed a powerful early fascination with horses in the way of children who grow up around them. He could name every horse on the property before he could reliably count to 10, and his particular favorite was Atlas, whom he called Taz in the shorthand of toddlers, and who bore the child's enthusiastic attentions with the dignified patience of a great horse who has decided a specific small person is worth tolerating. The land kept being land, demanding and generous by turns, and Celia and Graham worked it together in the way they had always done, with honesty and attention, and the knowledge that everything worthwhile requires sustained effort. There were hard years and easier years. A drought in 1886 that cut their grazing capacity and required them to sell part of the herd before they were ready. A particularly good spring the following year that brought the grass back and let them rebuild. A year of good beef prices that let them put a new roof on the Double B's main house and add a proper second room for James and the space they were going to need because Celia was pregnant again. Their second child was born in the spring of 1887, another boy, which surprised them both slightly since they had both privately assumed it would be a girl this time. Graham's expression when the doctor came out and told him a second son was so honestly startled and then so immediately delighted that Martha Hadley, who was still attending these occasions, laughed out loud. "You'd think you'd never heard of a boy before," she told him. "I expected a girl," Graham said, entirely honest. "Babies have their own opinions about that," Martha said. This one was named Samuel, which was Graham's middle name and a name Celia had always liked for its plain weight and honesty. Samuel Aaron Brooks came into the world loud and determined, which he remained, and where James was thoughtful and quiet and methodical, Samuel was exactly the opposite, fast and curious, and absolutely certain about everything. And the two of them together were an education in how two people who grew up in the same house could be entirely different people. The family found its shape around itself, the way families do, the particular grammar of a group of people who love each other and live closely enough to know each other completely. Graham read to the boys in the evenings from Celia's books, including the battered Shakespeare that she had read herself to pieces, and she would hear his voice from wherever she was in the house, steady and warm, and she thought sometimes about that morning on the Calvert Road when she was standing in the mud with raw heels and a stone in her chest, and the sound of hooves from the north. She had thought once, in those first terrible hours after the storm, that losing Duchess was the worst thing that could happen. And then Duchess had been found, injured but alive, and Graham had appeared with his saddlebag of supplies, and everything after that had been exactly what everything after that had been. She thought about what it required for a thing to happen, the storm and the fence post, and the lightning and the branch and a horse's particular fright, and a man on the right road at the right moment. And she did not know whether to call it luck or providence or simply the mysterious arithmetic of the world, but she thought it was worth being grateful for regardless of what it was called. Duchess lived to be 20 years old, which was a good age for a horse, and when she went on a warm spring morning with no drama, simply laying down in the paddock grass in the sun and not getting up again. Celia was 40 years old by then, and she sat with Duchess for a while and let herself feel everything there was to feel. And then she went into the house where Graham was, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And he did not say anything because he knew when there was nothing adequate to say, and that was one of the 10,000 things she loved about him. Atlas lived to 22, which was remarkable even for a horse of his exceptional quality, and James, who was 16 when Atlas died, was devastated in the way of a child who has loved a specific animal since before he could speak clearly. Graham sat with James and they talked about Atlas for a long time, all the particular memories of him, and Celia listened from the kitchen and thought about grief and love and how they are always the same thing. In the years between those losses and everything on either side of them, the life at the Double B and the Beckett parcel was full and textured and real. Cobb retired when he was 67, and they threw him a supper that lasted until midnight and gave him the quarter horse he had always favored, and he went to live with his daughter's family in Tucson and rode occasionally. Tomas became the foreman in his place and proved excellent at it. Elias stayed until he chose to go, which was when he was 50 and had saved enough money to buy a small piece of land of his own up north near Flagstaff, which he wanted to farm rather than ranch. And Celia and Graham helped him with the negotiations and the paperwork and the letter writing that such a purchase required. And when he rode out, it was with the particular straightness of a man who has arrived at exactly where he intended to go. Darnell Prout died in 1889 of a stroke, having never successfully purchased Celia's 40 acres or Graham's Double B or the Calvert parcel or any of the other properties he had been pressing at. His land was divided among his children, and the new owners were ordinary neighbors with no particular agenda, and the south fence line became simply a fence line between two ranches rather than a border of an ongoing argument. Martha Hadley retired from her boarding house in 1891 and came to stay with Celia and Graham for a month that became a season that became an arrangement, because the Double B was large enough, and Martha was too much herself to be put anywhere she did not want to be, and she was useful in the ways of a person with her particular combination of experience and judgment, and she adored James and Samuel with the uncomplicated fierceness of someone who has no grandchildren of her own. Ruth married eventually, a man in San Antonio named Peter Calloway, who was decent and steady and slightly shorter than her, which she mentioned in her letter with her characteristic dryness. She and Peter came to visit in 1893 with their 2 daughters, and the Calloway girls and the Brooks boys, who were now 9 and 6 respectively, had the particular chemistry of children who have heard about each other for years and are finally meeting, which is to say they were immediately either allies or adversaries depending on the activity, and the house was loud and wonderful for 3 weeks. James, at 17, began to show the interest in land and cattle management that told his parents he was going to stay, that the territory was his world as it was theirs. He was already doing real work on the ranch, not child's work but the genuine demanding work of cattle ranching, and he had his mother's practical precision and his father's patience and his own additional quality that was entirely his own, a kind of quiet boldness, a willingness to try things. Samuel, at 14, was considering everything else, which was also fine. He had a talent for figures that had made the account books his natural territory, and he spoke of studying law, which was not an idle ambition in a territory that was moving steadily toward statehood. Celia supported it completely and told him so, and Graham said, "Wherever you end up being useful is where you should be," which was the most Graham thing he had ever said and the most correct. On a warm evening in October of 1896, the kind of evening that comes in the territory when summer is truly done, and the air is clear and cool, and the sky is that specific shade of deep blue that precedes the dark, Celia and Graham sat on the porch of the Double B. It was a larger porch than the one on her old homestead, added some years back when they expanded the house, and it faced west over their combined land, over the grass and the fences and the shapes of cattle in the middle distance and the line of mountains beyond. James was inside with a map and some books, doing the research he had started on an irrigation scheme that he believed could extend the North Pasture's productive season. Samuel was writing a letter to a professor at a college in Tucson with whom he had begun a correspondence about the legal aspects of territorial land rights, which was both very Samuel and entirely typical of a 16-year-old who had already skipped past several stages of growing up. Graham was 54 now, and the years were in his face the way years are in the faces of people who have spent them outside and in honest work, not harshly but legibly, and Celia was 36, and she wore her own years the same way, and they were both entirely comfortable with the people they had become. "I was thinking today," Celia said, "about the morning I met you." "The morning after the storm," he said. "I was standing at the edge of the Calvert Road," she said, "and I was working very hard at not crying." "I know," he said. "I could see it." She looked at him. "You could. I could see exactly what it cost you not to," he said. "It was one of the first things I noticed about you. Not that you were crying, that you were not, and what that said about who you were." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought you stopped because you were on your way somewhere." "I stopped because you looked like someone who needed help and was not going to ask for it," he said. "That's a specific kind of person I've always found interesting." "And now," she said, "now I find that I've spent 14 years with exactly that kind of person," he said, "and I'd like to spend another 40. She reached over and took his hand on the arm of the porch chair, the same gesture she had made on her porch steps years ago, and he closed his fingers around hers, the same closing, the same certainty. "Graham," she said. "Celia," he said. The evening settled around them, the specific dusk of the Arizona territory with its enormous sky going red and gold and then deep blue, and the land stretched out before them in the last of the light, her land and his land and their land, all of it and all of them together. Inside the house, James turned a page on his map and made a note in the margin. Samuel addressed an envelope with his careful, precise handwriting. The horses moved slowly in the paddock in the dusk, the current generation, the grandchildren of Atlas and Duchess in spirit if not in blood. A fire would be lit soon, the evening meal made, the small domestic business of the night going forward the way it always went forward. There was a photograph on the mantel inside, taken in Redrock 2 years ago by a photographer who passed through the territory with the new equipment that was becoming more common. And in it, you could see Graham standing with his hand resting on Celia's shoulder, and James to his left and Samuel to Celia's right. And everyone in it was looking at the camera except Celia, who was looking sideways at Graham with an expression that the photographer must have simply caught by accident, or else recognized as the most true thing in the frame and chosen not to interrupt. It was the expression of a woman who has found exactly what she did not know she was looking for, and who has the further good fortune of knowing it. On the wall beside the photograph was the old journal, the leather-bound one with the heavy pages, a little worn now at the corners from years of use. She had filled it and bought another, and then another, and the stack of them on the shelf above her mother's writing desk was the record of everything. The practical records of the ranch, the accounting and the weather notes and the cattle numbers, and between those pages, because Celia had never been able to entirely separate the practical from the personal, everything else. The storms and the seasons, the growing of suns, the thousand conversations and the silences between them, the particular quality of light on the Arizona territory in different months and different years, the morning she had stood on the Calvert Road in the mud, the Tuesday that changed everything. She could hear the boys inside now, James's lower voice and Samuel's still carrying the last of its upward swing, the two of them talking about something with the animated focus of young men who are interested in the world. She could hear Graham breathing beside her in the quiet of the porch, steady and sure, real and present, the sound she had been falling asleep to for 14 years and intended to fall asleep to for every year after this one. The stars were coming out above the mountains. The cattle settled in the pasture. The breeze moved through the dry grass with its old sound. Celia Beckett, who had become Celia Brooks while remaining Celia Beckett, who had kept her 40 acres and her name and her own particular fierce intelligence, and had added to all of that a man who deserved her and sons who were becoming themselves, and a life that was exactly the size and shape of what she had been building toward without always knowing the blueprint, leaned back in her chair and looked at the stars. She thought about Duchess, who had been 12 hands of determined bay mare, and had broken through a fence in a storm and led Celia, unknowing, to the edge of the Calvert Road at exactly the right moment. She thought about the way suffering in one direction can sometimes be the road to something that would otherwise have been missed. She thought about the morning Graham had tied Atlas at her gate with his canvas bag of supplies, and the particular warmth of his hands on her horse's injured leg in the lamplight of the barn, the competence and care of them. She thought about all the things that had to happen exactly as they happened in order for this evening to exist. The storm and the fence and the road. The Tuesday mornings, and the porch steps and the fire in the winter. The wedding in April and the two boys and the summer of good grass and the drought and the recovery and the photograph on the mantel and the journal on the shelf and the horses in the paddock and the cattle in the pasture and the sound of Graham's breathing beside her now. All of it, every piece of it leading to this. Graham squeezed her hand. "Come inside soon," he said, not as a directive but as an invitation. "I'll start the fire." "In a minute," she said. He stood unhurried and went inside, and she heard the door close behind him, and then the sounds of the house receiving him, the voices of her sons and then Graham's voice joining them, easy and warm, and the small definitive sounds of a fire being laid. Celia sat alone for one more minute on the porch in the dark, with the stars overhead and the land spread out before her, her land, and she felt the full particular weight of her life, not as a burden but as substance, as the evidence of everything she had chosen and everything that had chosen her. Then she went inside. The fire was already burning when she came through the door, casting its warm light across the room, across the photograph and the journals and the battered Shakespeare and the faces of the people she loved most. And Graham looked up from the fireplace when she came in, and his eyes found hers across the room, gray-green and steady, the color of sage after rain. She crossed the room and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And James and Samuel were arguing amiably about something related to the irrigation scheme. And outside the Arizona night was enormous and full of stars. And inside there was fire and family, and the specific warm reality of a life built by two people who had found each other on a muddy road after a storm, and had not wasted the finding. The territory outside was still wild in all the ways it had always been wild, harsh and beautiful and indifferent to human plans, in the way that only the oldest landscapes can be. But inside the Double B on that October evening in 1896, everything was exactly right, and the future was large and waiting. And Celia Brooks, née Beckett, who had once stood at the edge of a road with raw heels and a stone in her chest and worked very hard at not crying, had not the slightest reason in the world for tears.